Ranger William here from the Overmountain Victory National Historic Trail, bringing you another episode of Trail Talk. We're trying to get to the stories behind the story of the Overmountain Victory National Historic Trail, the Overmountain settlements, and the American frontier. Now, most studies of the American Revolution, they're going to start with the French and Indian War. This is going to be the last great clash of European empires over who would control the North American continent. Now, the results of this war was the removal of French claims and a gigantic war debt for the British. Now, these are factors that are going to play a key role in dissolving that relationship between Britain and her colonies. Now, another impact of the war and those effects is going to be on the lives of the colonists themselves. Some leading officers of the Patriots, the Revolutionaries, they had served alongside the British during the French and Indian War. And some of the younger patriots during the American Revolution, they maybe perhaps remember seeing parts of the French and Indian War when they were children on the frontier of the colonies. So the world that these children grew up in was filled with reminders of that clash of empires. So to better understand the French and Indian War and how it played out in the American frontier in the lives of our future patriots, what that would have been like, we're joined by Jason Melius. Jason is the historic interpreter 2 at Fort Dobbs State Historic Site in Statesville, North Carolina. He's got a bachelor's in history from Winston-Salem State University, a master's of library and information studies from UNC Greensboro, and for the last 27 years has been a living historian, sharing the amazing history of early America with the public, and professionally, for 7 years, has been a historic interpreter at various museums and an archivist for 3 years, really getting hands-on and digging into the history. So Jason, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Will. Glad to be here.
So the first question I've got for you, we're talking about this last major clash of empires, the French and Indian War, a huge thing to begin to even try to dive into to get a better handle on. And that's if we just discuss the American theater of it, not the other global theaters where this war is being fought out. So focusing on the North American theater, focusing on the western border of the English colonies, from about Pennsylvania to Georgia. That's where most of our people are going to be coming from for the later story of the Revolution. What are some kind of like the quick and dirty bullet points to help us find our way and get into understanding the French and Indian War here?
All right, well, with a look at just the Southern theater being Pennsylvania and South, the war started in Western Pennsylvania by George Washington, and that was in May of 1754, and the war very quickly erupted and enveloped the entirety of the 13 colonies from Nova Scotia to South Carolina. But again, we're focusing on the South. So the frontiers of Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, and even what's now West Virginia were a terrifying place to live after about 1755. There was just widespread warfare. French allied Indians were attacking settlers as far south as the Virginia border in massive numbers, and even into North Carolina and South Carolina a bit. There were 3 major campaigns to take a French fort in what's now Pittsburgh. That was Fort Duquesne. The first campaign was in 1754, and that's the one that started the war. The second was in 1755, and the third and the successful one was in 1758. And the 1758 campaign, in a way, contributed to another war within the French and Indian War called the Anglo-Cherokee War. And this is what really had a major, major impact on North and South Carolina. It led to the proclamation of 1763, which saw a expansion of settleable grounds and ultimately led to the westward expansion in the Carolinas.
So you're not only looking at these empires clashing and changing flags, massive land changing hands, but you're looking at, from what you're saying, these various little things that are going to be these major points. Like you mentioned, Fort Pitt, this major British post, used to be this major French post. Right. You're looking at these 3 campaigns that are and then going to be spinning off into another war that even more affects the southern frontier. It's really not hard to see why this is such a defining movement, a moment in pushing forward the revolution.
Right.
So when we're looking at the fighting on the frontier, the Pennsylvania and South, you've got all these different campaigns, 54, 55, 58. You got the spin-off war with the Anglo-Cherokee War. What are some key figures, some big names that we're going to see kind of pop out of this fighting that are kind of important for us to know?
Well, we have, there's a number of names that are important, and Major General Edward Braddock is one of the early ones. He was the overall commander of all of the British forces in North America in 1755, and he led and designed a campaign against French Fort Duquesne in that year. He approached it in a very European methodology and failed epically. So Edward Braddock is really important when we discuss the southern part of the French and Indian War. Another important figure is the commander of the 1758 campaign, Brigadier General John Forbes. He was an incredibly talented officer. He was a career Scottish soldier who served in the British military for over 30 years until his death in 1759. Unfortunately, because of his inept ability to negotiate native diplomacy, he contributed greatly to the Anglo-Cherokee War. His failures as an Indian agent, Indian negotiator, he hosed it. He was important in securing Fort Duquesne for the British and ultimately ending a lot of the hostilities on the frontier of Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia. One of the more notable figures is George Washington. Everybody knows George Washington. He's the guy that started the war. He's credited. Lord Pitt, one of the heads of the British government, said this young Virginian has set the world ablaze. He takes it on the chin for his involvement in the start of the French and Indian War. He rose very quickly through the ranks in the Virginia militia to be commander of the Virginia Regiment. And in the 1758 campaign, he refused because he wasn't given a British commission. He served as an aide-de-camp. Actually, I think I got that wrong. Oops. That's right. So I apologize. I misinformed us. So in 1758, he was in command of the Virginia regiments and in most of the provincial forces. So he retired at the end of the Forbes campaign. And my favorite figure that I have to plug, even though he's not as widely known, is Hugh Waddell. He was the commander of North Carolina's forces during the French and Indian War. And this guy, he started the war in 1754 as a lieutenant and raised quickly to a captain and then quickly to major and then lieutenant colonel and then colonel of all of Western North Carolina. He, during the 1758 campaign, is described as having dressed and acted the Indian in all manner. He learned how to fight from the Cherokee and was really important in North Carolina's immediate post-war history.
Okay, so you got some great names here. You got some British-born generals, some American officers. Are there any other kind of big ones you wanted to share?
Yeah, one of the most notorious, Griffith Rutherford.
Ooh.
He is during the Anglo-Cherokee War, he is a captain of the North Carolina militia, and he spends literally 50 and 60 days ranging with his militia companies on the frontiers of North Carolina in 1759, 60, and 61. He is really active, and this is basically where he learns everything that he puts into play in 1775.
Mm-hmm. Because, yeah, I mean, when you look at some of the pension records of men who are going to go on and serve on the Kings Mountain campaign, they're from North Carolina. They'll talk about under General Griffith Rutherford, one and the same here. So like you said, most people have heard about George Washington and how he had service in the French and Indian War, kind of the guy who started the whole thing, but they may not know about these other leading patriot figures who actually have ties back to this earlier service. And I know there'll be some people who comment or want to know, well, why didn't you talk about some of the other ones? And of course, there's tons of big names later in American history who are involved in the French and Indian War. Thomas Gage, Horatio Gates, Daniel Boone, Daniel Morgan, all those guys. But
the Swamp Fox.
The Swamp Fox, yeah. So just everyone know, we know there's a lot of them out there. We just wanted to highlight a few as we're moving through our questions. I'm sure there's some great resources out there to dive in and get some deeper information. But kind of turn into one of the maybe lesser known officers that's involved with the Kings Mountain campaign, but Edward Lacy, future leader of South Carolina militia. When you get looking into his background, he actually ran away from his home in Pennsylvania at the age of 13 and served as a pack horseman for some Pennsylvania soldiers, some Pennsylvania provincials on Braddock's campaign, the one in 1755 you were telling us about that did not go well. Can you tell us a little more detail about how Braddock failed, or was it a failure on his part, or just a victory on the French part? What happened with his march?
Well, Braddock was very much wanted to run this campaign as a typical European theater operation. He was hauling heavy artillery because he wanted to lay siege to Fort Duquesne, and this necessitated cutting a road from Winchester, Virginia, up through to cross the Monongahela River a couple times and ultimately invest this fort. So this was a very slow campaign. He divided his force into two main groups. His brigade, Braddock's brigade, was the vanguard of the army, included the woodcutters and one of the British regular regiments, along with a bunch of provincials. And they very slowly cut their way through the wilderness, building a road, a proper wide road to haul wagons and siege guns. Along the way, they were getting constantly harassed by Native Americans that were allied to the French, people like the Shawnee, Wyandots, Ottawa, Mingo, Lenape, Ojibwe. The list kind of goes on and on. They're sniping at them and going in on small raids, attacking their woodcutters. James Smith is an awesome autobiography if you ever want to read one about this period. Skuwa is what it's called. And Braddock, he's crossed the Monongahela, gets ready to do a second crossing, manages to get across it, and once he's established on the other side of the river, the French regulars and French allied natives attack his vanguard and envelop them very quickly, and Braddock absolutely refuses to adopt to American tactics. He wants this to be fought in a European way with tight lines and volley fire, while he's being attacked along the entirety of his army and almost surrounded of his first brigade. And it fails miserably because they're just getting overwhelmed.
Wow. So with Edward Lacy being a pack horseman, being in the rear, he probably would not have been up taking this sniping fire, taking these Indian attacks. But from what I've heard about it, the main part of the army who gets the brunt of that assault, when they break, it's just panic that flows into the rest of the column, and just people cut horses from the wagons and they just run. You've got Daniel Boone and Daniel Morgan there as teamsters who escape. again, this Edward Lacy's 13 years old in this campaign. It's hard to imagine the impact that kind of terror would have on this young kid. And later he's going to be leading some patriot militia up the wooded hillsides to Kings Mountain. So people often talk about, oh, it's the lessons learned from the French and Indian War. It's when George Washington saw how bad Braddock's defeat went. That's when he realized that you have to use the terrain and stuff. I don't know if we buy that so much, because Washington was a major stickler for having a real trained army. But definitely some other people, maybe like Daniel Morgan, who was there growing up on the frontier, seeing this, it maybe rubs off a little bit on him. But speaking of Morgan, he's kind of from the Winchester, Virginia area. Other commanders of the Kings Mountain campaign, they're spending parts of their childhood, parts of their lives in and around Winchester during the French and Indian War. So do we know how this area of Northern Virginia would have been affected by the war? I know you mentioned earlier that we're getting raids, French-inspired raids, Indian raids, all the way down along the Virginia frontier, notably from Fort Duquesne. But do we have any kind of more details about what that was like? What kind of troops were involved? Any kind of major clashes in Northern Virginia, the Winchester area? Just kind of life in that region.
Winchester itself was kind of a hotbed of activity. It was the jumping off point for Braddock's army in 55. And in 1756, George Washington selected it to be his headquarters. And ultimately a Fort Loudon, one of 3 Fort Loudons, is built there. And this is a major earthen and wood fortification. It's his command headquarters, so it's kind of the backbone or the spine of the 80 Virginia forts that are constructed in this period. But it is, again, the headquarters. And unfortunately, I'm not as well versed in all of the details of the activity that happened in that area, but that area of Virginia was hot. There was a lot of small skirmishes going on between ranging companies, the Virginia Regiment, and these French native allies, and French regulars at times, French troops de la Marine and others. But yeah, this is it's a nasty place to live.
So I'm trying to imagine being a kid and trying to raise a family in the Winchester area. It's like a living on a military installation. If you have the headquarters of the Virginia Regiment, these major campaigns coming through, forts and defenses being built around you, and you're saying how it's a lot of small actions. Yeah. These small actions are going to be targeting the people on the fringes, not in the heart of the town, but right out in their fields, tending cattle. So you have that constant fear of, I can't go get food because we may not come back. Kind of being under siege in Winchester.
Yeah, as you're plowing your field, when you get to the end of the row, the farthest from your house, is there someone waiting there to kill you?
Jeez. So you've got to imagine that's going to have an effect on some of these guys growing up. But they are growing up. War does not stop people from living their lives. Looking at any kind of records of land grants, marriage records, birth records, people are moving. They are getting married. They're having kids in the middle of this terrifying conflict. So 2 of the officers of the Kings Mountain campaign, Frederick Hambright and actually Loyalist officer Ambrose Mills, they both moved south from Virginia in the 1750s during the Indian War, and they resettle in North Carolina. So you talked a little bit about the Indian raids on the Virginia frontier. Do we know why they would have chosen this move? Why they feel like just going one colony down is going to be a difference?
Well, you have to. Starting in 1755, there was just widespread attacks throughout Virginia, throughout the Shenandoah Valley, the Appalachian crest and to the southwestern Virginia, just absolutely terrifying widespread attacks. I just recently was loaned a copy of the South Carolina colonial records of South Carolina Indian documents relating to Indian affairs, and there's a whole series of depositions of these folks in Virginia who, these are people that are going out, and as we were talking about, they're farming, and a bunch of Shawnee come in and basically say, hey, we're Shawnee and we're going to kill you if you don't give us all this stuff. And, you know, so they go and they give them everything, and then the Shawnee kind of rough them up a little bit and say, don't mess with us or we'll kill you. Consider yourself lucky. And then the militia all gets together and they go to try to get the stuff back from the Shawnee, and the Shawnee kill them all. In North Carolina, this wasn't happening. There were a few attacks, mostly along the Catawba River in North Carolina, but this North Carolina was seen as a safe haven. The people in southwestern Virginia, in particular, in 1755 and 56, flee in massive numbers to especially Bethabara, in what's today Winston-Salem. At the peak, Bethabara is hosting over 300 refugees.
Wow.
And I mean, for a 70-person community hosting 300, and who are all bringing news of these horrific attacks, North Carolina was a dead zone as far as they were concerned. It was a safe haven, and there was a lot of open land there. Here,
yeah,
North Carolina.
So that's really important that we point this out, is because whenever we're talking about migration patterns and why people are coming to the Carolinas, it's often the story of, oh, the wagon road, and they were just coming down from Virginia, from Pennsylvania for economic reasons. But let's not forget, this is happening during the French and Indian War too. So on top of all the economic reasons, like you talked about, there's land to be had. You also have this danger. You have this fear of, we cannot stay in Virginia. It is not safe. And
Right.
They start heading south. So it kind of presses on the accelerator a little bit on that migration.
It's important to note, I should note that not only was there a lot of land in North Carolina, it was unbelievably cheap. It was somewhere around £5 an acre. It was disgustingly cheap down here. So Lord Granville was just kind of handing out money, just like, hey, move to my lands, have it for cheap. And people were flocking here. There's some pretty, if you read Ramsey's Carolina Cradle, you can track the records of the number of people moving even during the war, but especially right after the war. It really skyrockets because the land is so cheap and plentiful, and it's fertile.
Oh, I mean, when you're looking at a Virginia farmer who's scared for his life and wants more land, you're just describing paradise right here.
Right.
So we're going to kind of shift gears a little bit to another conflict that you've mentioned. We've talked about the French influence and the French allied Indian nations who are attacking the English frontier. And we did mention that men like Francis Marion have served during this period, but also Andrew Pickens. But they're serving in this other part of the war. They're not serving necessarily against these French allied nations to the north, but they're serving in the Anglo-Cherokee War down in South Carolina. So can you tell us a little bit more about this kind of second chapter, kind of why this is and isn't considered part of the French and Indian War?
Well, the Cherokee were early on in the French and Indian War were Carolina and, well, colonial allies, British allies. They were staunch British allies, except for two towns, Great Tellico and Chautauqua. I always butcher the pronunciation. It's two out towns that have a pretty solid French alliance. They have a lot of French agitators in their town, but the rest of the Cherokee Nation is incredibly pro-British. And to the point that in 1758, They send hundreds of warriors to Pennsylvania, close to 1,000, to help the British, help General Forbes against helps Forbes and the colonists to fight against the French and their native allies. The not only sending their men directly to Forbes' army, they're also sending war parties out to Illinois to harass the rear of the French. So the Cherokee have their fingers deep into this as English allies, but as I mentioned earlier, Forbes butchered native diplomacy. And on top of that, when the Cherokee began returning home to Virginia, through Virginia, about 40 of them get murdered by Virginia civilians. These are kind of indiscriminate murders. There are some accounts of them having their body parts hung on the roads outside of what's now what was Augusta Courthouse. They're slaughtered by their friends, and this led to escalations back and forth. The Cherokee, of course, having to get revenge for the murder of their loved ones. South Carolina getting involved and demanding that the murderers, the people who were seeking justice, get turned over to be executed. The Cherokee send 23 chiefs, peace chiefs, to try to prevent any further bloodshed, and they're taken hostage, and ultimately a bunch of them are murdered, which it all leads to a war between the Carolinas and the Cherokee. And the Cherokee began attacking everywhere from Southwest Virginia, as far east as what's now Winston-Salem, through down to the borders of Georgia. Wow. And yeah, they open up, they roll the frontier back almost 100 miles. And these are revenge attacks. It's not like they're just kind of going out and attacking at random. There's vengeance being had here. It's justice that they're trying to get for a long list of wrongs. And ultimately it sees two British campaigns, major campaigns, run against the Cherokee. In 1760, Colonel Montgomery of the 77th Regiment of Foot leads close to 1,500 men to attack the Cherokee and ultimately get defeated just south of what's now modern Franklin, North Carolina, in a somewhere close to a 6-hour battle. They take such heavy casualties by a force that's half their size that they're forced to retreat. The next year in 1761, another campaign sets off against the Cherokee after the Cherokee capture a British fort in Tennessee called Fort Loudon. They lay siege to a couple forts in South Carolina. So the British send a second army in 61, and this one is almost double the size of the previous one. It includes Mohawks, Stockbridge, Chickasaw, Catawba, Indian allies, and they ultimately defeat the Cherokee. And between the two campaigns, the British burn 23 Cherokee towns, and they destroy all of their crops. That's like 4,000 people who they've destroyed the homes and food of. So, and at the same time that that's going on, there's an army of North Carolina and Virginia troops in what's now Kingsport, Tennessee, and they're getting poised to attack southward through the Cherokee Overhill towns. So it's almost like a big pincer move, except the provincial army is a little slower than the regular army. So the Cherokee, though, are facing this, are forced to give up. And they cede thousands of acres of land, faced with arms embargoes. They're hosed. And this also sets them up for, during the Revolution, the older generation fights staunchly to be neutral or almost pro-American, while the younger warriors like Dragon Canoe and his crowd want war. So, and this is all fallout from the Anglo-Cherokee War. It's really hard to make it that brief.
I get it. Complex topics in short amounts of time. But like you were just explaining there, that's a great way to understand why you have the Cherokee Nation in the Southern colonies in the Revolution staying with the British, despite all these attempts by American Indian agents, Joseph Martin being one that's tied into our story really well, who are reaching out to the Cherokee, trying to ally them with the Americans, or at least get them to stay neutral. And that older generation is open to that idea. Even though they're strong British allies, they've kind of...
I said Griffith Rutherford.
Oh, yeah.
Opposes it for him.
So, yeah, I mean, you've got on these two sides, you've got these colonists who are leading these kind of land-hungry, terrible campaigns, and then you got these other Americans who are trying to be peace agents. But the Cherokee, again, like you were saying, that older generation, they remember the Anglo-Cherokee War, so they're not as quick to want to jump into this situation again.
Right.
And so from what you're describing, if you were a militiaman, a settler on the southern frontier of the English colonies, what we call today the French and Indian War was really more of the Indian then Indian War. Right. These guys weren't really fighting against French soldiers at all, but they were fighting against the neighboring Indian nations. First, the ones who were military and trade allies of the French, and later when the relationship breaks down between the British and the Cherokee Nation. So we're going to fast forward a little bit to kind of with the end of the war, because when the war is done in 1763, but then almost immediately right after that, you're looking at the mid and late 1760s. You have this massive migration. You mentioned it earlier about how this flood of people coming down into North Carolina. Joseph Winston, one of our big leaders, comes down into the Carolinas in 1766. Benjamin Cleveland in 1769. William Campbell moves out to the far western tip of Virginia in 1767. This massive southern and westward migration, why are they all of a sudden pushing so hard and fast? We talked about how you have the land that's available in the Carolinas. It's pretty cheap. It's done. You have the French allied Indian nations attacking the Virginia frontier. So why are we seeing this massive rush?
Well, there's peace. There's the Indians have been subdued. Your French allied Indians are no longer French allies. The Cherokee have been completely crushed. And you also have in 1763 the proclamation line established, where this is a limit to English settlement, which establishes the Eastern Continental Divide basically as the line that you're not supposed to cross, even though tons of people do. They feel it's safe to cross this line because they think that the government is going to back them against the Native Americans who they've just defeated. So it's safe to steal Indian land. It's safe to push westward.
And I mean, that makes a lot of sense if you have these guys, especially if they served in the militias and they're veterans and they feel like they've won this war, they've defeated this enemy, they've earned this land. To then be told that they're not, that's going to be a huge issue later on as you're getting near the Revolution. I know one of the more common, the reasons that people will explain is no taxation without representation, but we can't forget that when you get to the Western frontiers, you're dealing with the land issue, and the government is protecting the Indian nation's claims to the territory more than it is the colonies. Right. That's going to be a major monkey wrench right there. So at the end of the war, what are some kind of big ideas or concepts that come out of the French and Indian War? I mean, you've got the defeat of the French. Does this mean that the relationship between the colonies and the British are going to be strained or changed, or the relationships between the various colonies themselves, between the colonies and the Indian nations and the British, like we just talked about with the proclamation line. How does this what kind of ripples does this stone make?
There's a lot of ripples, and they're really deep waves, not ripples. Talking about the 1763 proclamation line, in a way, this is a major win for those militiamen, but they don't see it that way. Up until 1763, there was no limit to Western settlement. All of a sudden in 1763, there is a boundary line that they're not supposed to cross. And these people who had just fought on behalf of, as their eyes, on behalf of the British Empire to win this war, think that, well, we earned this land. And they kind of act like spoiled kids about it. Not only is, they get, the land is opened up already, but the limit that they see or are given really isn't that drastic, because it's well beyond the current settlement patterns, except in southwestern Virginia. On top of that, the British and the colonies, they're strained now because even though the colonists started the war, this war was began by Virginia and George Washington, right? Britain stepped in and kept saying, hey, why don't you guys fight this war on your own that you started? Okay, you're not going to do that, so we'll send some troops over, but you need to help us. They start fostering a sense of cooperation between the colonies, and the colonies start getting this idea that you have to stand united or we're going to get destroyed by the French and their native allies. So this idea of cooperation that we see embodied in that little flag, that join or die flag, that comes from the French and Indian War.
Wow. So, I mean, you're looking at, you kind of wonder if there were any ministers in Parliament at the start of the Revolution who had been there for these earlier conversations and was like, you know what, we probably shouldn't have encouraged that so much.
Right.
That one guy in the corner just shaking his head. I told you that was a bad idea.
And then there's other things that play in that seem minor on the onset, but when the intolerable acts are passed, one of them is the Quartering Act, in which British troops are required to be housed in homes, which interestingly was the same as being done in Great Britain itself. But there were conflicts that erupted as early as 1757 over quartering British troops. Their Brits are asking, when they levy taxes after the war, like the stamp tax, that horribly oppressive stamp tax and tea tax. That's sarcasm, by the way. They're asking to pay back the war debt for a war that was fought to preserve the colonies. It's a little frustrating to look at it in hindsight like this and see that the stuff that the American Revolution was started over were things that were kind of our own cause, if that makes sense.
Well, like you just mentioned, paying for the defense, it's increasingly talked about, but you don't hear it too often, that the taxes being raised were not just going to pay off Britain's debt, they were going to pay off the cost of defending the colonies. Like, it was right. Specifically marked to pay for the defense of the colonies.
Right.
So definitely have a lot of far-reaching impacts of the French and Indian War. So besides it being, yes, the French left, yes, it's military experience for a few people who are going to be leading figures in the American Revolution, but you're looking at these, as you said, not ripples, waves washing over the Atlantic, kind of starting to mess with that relationship between Mother Britain and the children of the colonies. and massive changes between the Indian nations and the British. The French are gone, alliances are changing. The Cherokee have gone against the British and been terribly hurt because of it. This is really setting up the board for when the revolution starts to pick up here in a few more years.
Right.
So thank you so much for taking the time and talking with us. Before we wrap up, kind of what are some things you would recommend, some resources for those who are wanting to kind of dive in a little more to what you've talked about today and learn a little bit more about the kind of the Western frontier, the Southern colonies in the French and Indian War?
As far as books go, my focus is really, I love the Anglo-Cherokee War, and I push towards books that talk about this subject because it's little understood and so incredibly important in North Carolina's history. But that said, there's a new book by a fellow named Torta. It's Carolina in Crisis. That's an excellent book that covers the Carolinas from about 56 to 63. Divided Paths by Thomas Hatley. That's a very similar talk. It's a little bit older. A fellow named John Moss wrote North Carolina in the French and Indian War, which is a good overall history of North Carolina's involvement from North Carolina sending troops up to Maryland, Pennsylvania, and even New York, to all the stuff that happened here, like at Fort Dobbs, where I work. Those are some excellent books, but also visiting Fort Dobbs. We work overtime to talk about the story of the French and Indian War and the Cherokee War and its impact on the Carolina frontier. There's 96 National Historic Park site. Yep. Okay. 96 is awesome. Fort Loudon in Tennessee is an incredible site, which there's historic Bethabara Park in Winston-Salem, which is a 1753 village site plus a 1756 fort site. It's a big archaeological park, and it's important to understanding the story of the backcountry of the Carolinas.
And just those sites that you were pointing out, looking at kind of diversity of the sources, you've got Fort Dobbs being a North Carolina kind of colony managed fort. Mm-hmm. And you got Loudon being British regulars out there in Tennessee. Fort 96, you hear all about it with the Revolutionary War, but like you pointed out, there's a lot of French and Indian War history there too. And then not only the civilian aspect of it at historic Bethabara, but the Moravian pacifist civilian aspect of it. So very kind of different avenues of approach. And again, I've looked at some of those books that you mentioned there, and there's some great resources. So I'd like to wrap up our time with you with just kind of a little what if hypothetical question, looking at kind of those waves you were talking about of the effects of the French and Indian War. So in the aftermath of the French and Indian War, the beginning of the revolution movement, we see the colonies start to cooperate more and stand together in opposition to British arms. The cooperation that you just pointed out was partly at the insistence, at the urging of the British government. But back during the French and Indian War, this was not the case of that cooperation. When each colony had acted in its own interests. So what do you think could have happened differently and kept the colonies separate? What changes would have kept these divided, separate colonies from viewing themselves as united in opposition to the British Crown?
That's a loaded question, Will. So the only thing I can come up with, if Washington had been an adult and had asked the French what was going on, what they were doing there at Humanville Glen, and not just ordered his men to open fire on a bunch of guys waking up before they've had breakfast. If he hadn't started the French and Indian War, it probably would have started some other way, but This is where the idea of cooperation comes from. Yes, there's a little bit earlier campaign in the 40s where Boston or Massachusetts asks for cooperation from help from other colonies, but really they're forced to cooperate during the Revolution, and during the French and Indian War. So if the war didn't happen, there's a lot of stuff that would have been taken away that was the fuel for the Revolution. If the British had fought the war entirely by themselves, instead of forcing help, if the war had started and the British just went, okay, we got this, you guys just chill out, kids, and the British fought it, the colonies wouldn't have been forced to cooperate. However, they still would have incurred a huge debt and probably asked to have that paid back. But that I think the cooperation is a huge factor.
Yeah, that's kind of what's been coming up throughout our conversation here a little bit. And like we talked about, again, these kind of misconceptions, well, I wouldn't say misconceptions, these accepted beliefs about the French and Indian War's impact on the Revolution, but then they're neglecting all these other aspects. Right. There's always taxation without representation, but not looking at the proclamation line and the limit of westward expansion. And they're always looking at, the British have this massive debt because of the war. The British want to put troops because of the war, and they're not looking at the cooperation, that unity that was created because of the war.
Right.
So not only do you have kind of the spark coming with that taxation, with that representation, the lack of representation, but that spark is landing on this powder keg that is a powder keg now. It's not these little individual charges. It's all in a barrel together, that unity from having to fight together.
Right. There's, that stuff that we see during the French and Indian War. We see Massachusetts send troops to New York. We see North Carolina send troops to Pennsylvania on 3 occasions, and ultimately to New York. You see these long distance relationships being built between the colonies that really helped during the Revolution.
Wow. So you can really see how this is going to be one of those major stepping stones to letting that revolution happen. So Jason, thank you again for talking with us. This has been really eye-opening and really informative about some of the waves coming from the French and Indian War.
Thanks, Will. I really appreciate the time.
And for those who've been watching, we've been talking with Jason Melius, archivist, historian, living historian, and currently historic interpreter up at Fort Dobbs State Historic Site in Statesville, North Carolina. And this has been another episode of Trail Talk, where we're talking about the world of the American frontier, trying to get to those stories behind the story of the Overmountain Victory National Historic Trail. So thanks for watching.